The instructions and information for what cells do. In other words, the characteristics of cells is stored in those cells' DNA molecules. A very special feature of DNA is that DNA is a self replicating molecule. In other words, DNA is a very complicated molecule that possesses the property that it's able to make copies of itself. Now, by most measures, DNA is not considered to be alive, but DNA is a very important aspect of many living things in the world. When the cells of a living organism divide, the DNA in those cells, the thing that gives the cells their properties, makes a copy of itself. So a cell divides into two cells. Each of those cells possess a copy that describes the characteristics of what the cells do, how the cells will behave, and so on. In principle, in the ideal scenario, when a cell divides, the DNA is going to make a perfect copy of itself each time, 100% of the time. In practice, this is not what is always going to occur. A mutation is an incident where there is a mistake or an error in copying the genetic information of the DNA molecule. Now, mutations could be helpful to an organism, they could be harmful to an organism. Most of the time, a mutation in a cell is not going to affect an organism whatsoever. Now, when I say affect an organism, I mean the ability of an organism to survive in its environment. If you think about human beings from, let's say, 20 or 30,000 years ago, the ability to see would be very important to your survival. The ability to see would help you gather food. The ability to see would help you see a predator from far away and know to hide or try to avoid that predator that you see way off in the distance. Eye color is a mutation within human beings that does not really affect our ability to see. So, a human being with brown or green or blue eyes, uh, the eye color does not really affect our ability to see. And so, by that measure, eye color does not really affect our ability to survive in our environment. So, eye color is an example of a human mutation that doesn't really have any effect on a human being's ability to survive. Now, why do mutations occur? There are a lot of reasons that a mutation might occur. One example of a reason or a mechanism that could cause a mutation is if you have an incoming particle of UV light. So, a really high energy particle of light could come in, it could strike a DNA molecule, and that energy is deposited into the DNA molecule and breaks it apart. And when that DNA molecule reforms, it might reform in a different way. So, this would be one example of a mechanism that could cause a mutation. Another mechanism that could cause a mutation could be some toxins in your environment. If there are toxins in an environment, those toxins might be absorbed by a body. The body is made up of a bunch of cells, so those toxins will get into the cells. And when the cells divide, those toxins might mess with the DNA as it is dividing. And that could cause a change in the information in when the cells divide. They don't produce a perfect copy of what they were before. Now, mutations occur randomly. There's no way to know which UV photon will hit which cell and cause which DNA strand to break apart and copy in incorrectly. But once a mutation does occur, you have an organism with a mutation, and that organism lives in a certain type of environment. And that environment might preference some individuals with a mutation over other individuals that do not possess the mutation. And this is a process known as natural selection. So, suppose we have an organism that, when it's very young, maybe it's only one or two or four cells large, there's a mutation in one of those cells. So, though that organism might end up growing up to be different from its parents by random chance through mutation. Now, if that organism has a certain mutation that benefits its survival, then that mutation will grow up to be strong and pass on that mutation to its offspring. And the offspring will have that mutation. And those offspring will then pass on the mutation to their offspring, and so on. As an example, let's think of a species of squirrels. Now, there are squirrels in the US and Canada. And let's suppose in northern Canada there is a species of squirrels, and one day there is a baby squirrel born with a mutation where that baby squirrel will tend to develop a much thicker coat than the other squirrels around it. Well, if that baby squirrel is going to grow up to have a thicker squirrel coat, then that baby squirrel will be better suited to survive in its environment. And if that squirrel is better suited to survive in its environment, it is more likely to live to the age where it could mate and reproduce and pass on the genetic material, pass on the DNA, that where its babies will have a thicker squirrel coat. And then they will have babies that have a thicker squirrel coat. And over time, the you will have a population of squirrels in northern Canada that have a thicker coat. Now, different organisms do reproduce at different rates. Bacteria might reproduce every 25 minutes or hour or day. Humans reproduce somewhere between every 20 to 30 years. So let's just take the middle, say 25 years. Dogs might reproduce every couple years, after 2 or 3 years. So different species will reproduce at different rates, and it takes a different amount of time for a generation to pass. It takes a different amount of time, in other words, to pass on your genetic information to the next generation. Now, after many, many generations have passed, you might have a situation where a certain organism passed its genes on, and then there were mutations and mutations, and you might end up at a point where one group of organism is not able to reproduce with a different group of organisms. So, for to go back to the squirrel example, you might have a situation where the squirrels in northern Canada reproduced to have a thicker coat. They did better than squirrels with a thinner coat. So the squirrels with a thicker, warmer coat survived and reproduced more than the squirrels with a thinner coat. And then they had more mutations within them. Meanwhile, there might be some squirrels in Tennessee that, because Tennessee has a warmer climate, they did not need a thicker coat. So they might have had some mutations that helped them do better in a warmer climate. And as in Tennessee, there are more snakes than in Canada. So maybe the squirrels were more timid about reptiles and better at running and hiding. Now, over time, you might have more divergence in the genetic information. And after many, many generations have passed, after thousands, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years later, the squirrels in Canada might be so different from the squirrels in Tennessee that they cannot, even though they are kind of similar, they cannot reproduce anymore because their genetic information is so different that they just cannot create viable offspring anymore. When that occurs, you previously had one species, now you have two species. You have different species that diverged due to living in different environments over many, many years. Many generations have passed. So, different organisms will reproduce at different rates, and this is why it's much easier to see mutations and evolution occur in small species like bacteria and viruses compared to larger, more complicated species like humans and squirrels and the like. In order to observe humans evolve and genetic differences in humans take place and take hold in different environments, even ever so slightly, you would need to watch humans over thousands of years, over many, many generations. Some examples of some very fast human evolution occur as, for example, in the mountains of Tibet. There are communities of people whose lungs are evolved to be able to better handle a low oxygen environment. People in Tibet live on the Tibetan plateau at a very high altitude. They are better suited to living in a lower oxygen environment compared to most people that live much closer to sea level. In Ethiopia, in a certain region of Ethiopia, there is an incredibly hot desert like region, And the people who have lived there for many generations have evolved the ability to do much better in extreme heat and low water compared to the average person. So even though we are still the same people, we are still able to reproduce with people from these regions, create viable offspring. There are slight differences in our genetic material that is beginning to diverge. Now, on the other hand, if you want to observe a simple species, observe like a bacteria, you would only need to wait a matter of weeks or months to see bacteria evolve. Because while humans typically take 20 to 30 years for one generation, and you need to wait many, many generations to begin to see differences, bacteria, if they only have a generation every couple hours, you only need to wait a matter of months before you see significant differences in bacteria. And this is the reason why you need to get a flu shot every year. The virus during one flu season might be very different from the virus in the next flu season, because in that matter of 8 to 12 months, the viruses will have had much opportunity to evolve, change their genetic material to the point where the antibodies in the vaccine that recognize the virus no longer apply to the next year's strain of virus. So, after many generations have passed, an organism might not be able to reproduce anymore with its predecessors. And at that point, we say we now have two species of organism rather than one. And so, when this occurs, what we previously had, as I said, was a single species, now became two species. Very often, differences in environment due to different geographic location might cause these natural selection effects to preference one species over another, and might cause one species to evolve into more than one species. Now, this could depend on a number of factors. This could depend on the differences in the local environment, among many other things. So, the time scale to observe this evolution does depend in part on the time scale it takes a species to reproduce. You need to go through many, many generations before you have one species become more than one species. Many, many generations for a single cell organism like a bacteria, or some very short lived organisms like some insects that might only live for weeks or months. We could observe evolution in those species very quickly. But for a species that lives much longer, much more time between birth and the age at which those species reproduce, like humans, it takes much longer for evolution to take place, because you need the same number of generations takes a lot more time to go through. So, the theory of evolution states that all species of life on Earth are going to be connected to each other, and all species of life on Earth are related to each other in some way. And all species and the diversity of life on Earth is a result of these slight modifications due to natural selection. As an analogy, think about if you have any siblings. So, if you have brothers and sisters, you will share a common ancestor with your brothers and sisters. Specifically, I'm talking about your common ancestor with your brother or sister is your parent. Now, if you share a common ancestor, you also share a common ancestor with your cousins. But this common ancestor is more distant than your parents. This common ancestor is one more generation back. So, your brothers and your sisters, you share the same parent, but your cousins, you share the same grandparent. Evolution is the exact same thing, except instead of going one or two generations back, we are going way back, many, many millions of generations. Technically speaking, you share somewhere down the line, way back when, a common ancestor with your dog. So, your dog is not only man's best friend, your dog is also some long distant cousin of yours, but we are talking millions of years ago that you have to go back before you share a common ancestor. So, evolution states that every organism on Earth, whether you're a bacteria or a plant or an animal or a fern or a dog or me or your dog, every organism on Earth evolved from Luca. Luca stands for the last universal common ancestor. So the last species that was just a single species that eventually would change and branch out in different directions until you have all the species on Earth that we see today. So this Luca was just the original organism that eventually evolved in different locations and became many different species. Now, for all we know, there may have been other organisms before Luca that evolved but died out before they could diverge. And there might have been other times when life evolved on Earth but died out completely. So every organism on Earth evolved according to the theory of evolution from a single common ancestor. And when I say theory here, by theory, what I mean is a theory here is used in the scientific context, where a theory is a very well tested model of science. The theory makes predictions, those predictions match the observed data. So when I say theory of evolution, I don't mean just a guess that is very hypothetical and speculative. By theory, I mean a very well tested statement that has a lot of evidence to support it. So every organism on Earth did evolve from some initial ancestor long, long ago in the history of the Earth. So even within just some organisms like butterflies, there is a lot of evolution. So way back long ago, you had one species of butterfly, and then they evolved into two species. And then depending on various environmental selection effects, you might have had more and more species diverge until you get the entire different range of butterflies we have today. And following the tree of life in the manner in which species evolve, we could look at the fossil record, and we could see that we are more closely related to tree shrews than dogs. So here are humans on the tree of life. This is the same tree of life from this picture right here. Here are humans, and we're just looking at this corner in the lower right. So humans, at some point in the past, we had a common ancestor with chimpanzees. Compared to the history of the Earth, this common ancestor was relatively recent. Compared to human lifetime, it was way distant in the past. But it was really only like 200,000 generations ago that we had a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. And then gibbons, we were even more distantly related to. Here's a tree shrew. So tree shrew would branch out around here, while humans, so we would have a common ancestor with a tree shrew, let's say about 80 million years ago, just to estimate. Here's the evolutionary track of dogs. So whatever became of dogs then diverged here, and dogs came up here. So our common ancestor with a dog was way back here. I'm just going to make up a number. Let's call this 100 million years ago. And also, when we look at the tree of life, notice all the dead ends. So here's a whole bunch of dead ends on the tree of life. Here's some dead ends. Here's a dead end. Whatever species was here, whatever kind of echinoderm this was, died off long, long ago, and there's no more of that type of species anymore. Now, this tree of life is not complete. This tree of life shows some of the living life forms on Earth today. There are many, many branches of this tree of life that are not shown, and more than 99.9% of all species that have ever existed on Earth are now extinct. So this tree of life does not contain all the species of life that has ever existed on Earth. This is just representative of how all the species of life are interconnected with each other. And if we look at the tree of life, we see at the same time there are moments in time where lots and lots of species all seem to die out at the same time. And that's what we call a mass extinction. So the mass extinction here, 66 million years ago, that was when the asteroid or the comet struck the Yucatan Peninsula, kicked up a whole bunch of stuff, dirt and dust into the atmosphere. That caused the Earth's climate to change significantly, and that caused a lot of species to die out. That was the asteroid or comet that killed the dinosaur. And we see when we track the tree of life many dead ends. And much earlier in the Earth's history, 252 million years ago, there was another mass extinction for another reason that caused many species on Earth to die out. Now, think about what we talked about mutations earlier. Mutations occur randomly. So, mutation is a random process, but natural selection, not so much. You cannot predict which gene, which particle within DNA this particle of light is going to come and mess up. So, there's really no way you could predict it. But once the mutation occurs, the selection process is not going to be so random. All organisms still live in the same environment, so that environment will encourage organisms with a mutation or will discourage organisms with a mutation. Or maybe the mutation will not help or hurt organisms, such as eye color affecting humans' ability to survive. Some mutations, though, are going to be preferenced by environment. A furry coat on a squirrel will help a squirrel survive in a cold climate. So, the traits that are beneficial to survival will be passed on to the next organism in the line. Some traits that are beneficial are going to come about in various directions on the tree of life. So, what by that what I mean is some traits will be possessed by different organisms just because those traits inherently help organisms survive. So, an organism, as an example, an organism that can see the world around it will have a higher probability of surviving and do better than an organism that cannot see. If you can see, you could look for food. You could look at sea predators and try to avoid them. Sometimes species that have very distant common ancestors will evolve separately and still possess traits because those traits just flat out benefit your ability to survive. The structure of the human eye and the structure of the cephalopod eye, cephalopods are like octopus, squid, cuttlefish. The structure of the eye of both species is very similar. Now there are a few differences. Human eyes, a lot of the nerve cells in human eyes are in the middle of the eye and in front of the light collecting cells. In octopus, the nerve cells are behind the light collecting cells. And in terms of which would make the better eye, technically speaking, the octopus eye is better than the human eye. But evolution doesn't ask if you're ideal for surviving. Evolution is just going to ask, are you good enough to survive? The human eye does have nerve cells between the light collecting cells and the lens where the light comes in, but these nerves don't affect our ability to survive enough to matter, so our eye is good enough. The octopus eye, by this measure, is more ideally suited to survive. So the structure of the human eye is very similar to the structure of an octopus eye, even though we haven't shared an ancestor for at least 500 million years, and our most recent common ancestor was probably just some type of worm swimming around in the ocean. We also share some other traits with cephalopods. We have, compared to other species around us, a very highly developed intellect. We have a closed circulatory system. So there are some traits that are beneficial to survival that different species will possess. And it's not that those traits help species in their environment, but those traits are just generically beneficial to environment, to survival. For example, a certain structure of wing could help a flying organism better move around in its environment. The last common ancestor of birds and bats was somewhere way back here, long, long ago. And the last common ancestor of insects and birds and bats was even much further in the past. But the same wing structure just makes you a better flyer. And if you're a better flyer, well, that helps you. So different organisms can evolve to have a similar wing structure just because that makes them better flyers. A certain body shape might make you a better swimmer. So even though you have a very distant common ancestor, such as dolphins and sharks, you still might end up having a similar body shape just because that body shape helps propel you through the water better. So, watch the 12 Days of Evolution from It's Okay to Be Smart, and also watch What Was the Ancestor of Everything from PBS Eons, and then we'll talk again in the next video.